Wisconsin Dairy Cutover, WI, September 1949. The air, sharp with the coming autumn, carried the scent of pine and cut lumber. On a cleared patch of land scarred by stumps, Klaas de Boer was building something that made no sense. It wasn't a cabin, not in the way anyone understood it. First, a long concrete slab, 60 feet by 20. Then, rising from the slab like the skeleton of some impossible metal whale, were the curved steel ribs of a military Quonset hut. It was enormous, a silver arch against the bruised purple of the late-day sky. Neighbors would slow their trucks on the rutted dirt road to stare. Arlo Finch, who farmed the adjacent 40 acres, stopped one afternoon, leaning against his fence post. "What in God's name is it, de Boer?" he'd called out. Klaas, securing a bolt high on a rib, paused. "A roof," he said, his voice carrying a thick Frisian accent. "A roof for what? The whole damned county?" Arlo's laugh was dry, like rustling leaves. The project became a local curiosity, then a joke. De Boer's Folly, they called it, or the Tin Cathedral. The most official scorn came from Roscoe Mercer, the county public health inspector. Mercer drove a county sedan and carried a clipboard, and his authority was rooted in the Wisconsin Dwelling Code of 1943. He stopped by twice during the initial framing, his face a mask of professional skepticism. He watched as Klaas and his young son, Jan, framed a small cabin at the front end of the slab, a barn section in the middle, and a storage area at the back, all under the single, cavernous arch. "You can't house livestock under the same roof as your family, Mr. de Boer," Mercer stated, his pencil tapping the clipboard. "It's a clear violation. Produces vectors for disease, not to mention the ammonia." Klaas wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "It's one building," he said, looking up at the arch that dwarfed them both. "But 3 rooms? Canvas walls?" Mercer shook his head, a thin smile on his lips. He made a note. "This is foolish, son. You're building a drafty, oversized shed that will be impossible to heat and illegal to occupy. The county will have to cite you." He drove away, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn, ignorant immigrant. The word spread from Mercer's office through the town. The Dutchman was not just eccentric, he was a fool, building a monument to his own failure before the first snows even fell. What did this Dutch shipbuilder, this former Navy Seabee, understand about a single, shared volume of air that a county inspector and a generation of Wisconsin builders had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn how the heat from a single cow can be worth more than a cord of wood, and how a lesson learned building ships in the cold North Sea could solve a problem on the frozen American frontier. If you appreciate stories of quiet genius against the grain, consider subscribing and letting us know in the comments what you think the most clever part of this design is. Klaas de Boer was not a carpenter. He had not grown up felling trees and notching logs. He was a man shaped by water, wind, and the unyielding physics of a hull moving through the sea. He was from Friesland, a province in the Netherlands where the land itself was a negotiated truce with the ocean. His family had built boats for generations in the polder yards, sturdy, efficient vessels designed to waste nothing, least of all space or warmth. His hands knew the curve of a plank, the seal of a joint, the smell of pitch and oakum. He understood enclosed systems where every cubic inch mattered because buoyancy was not a theory, but the line between life and death. Then came the war. Klaas, having immigrated to America before the conflict, joined the U.S. Navy. With his skills, he was a natural fit for the construction battalions, the Seabees. In the sweltering heat of the Pacific, he didn't build wooden ships. He built islands. He and his battalion raised airfields from crushed coral and erected entire bases in a matter of weeks. And the signature structure of their trade was the Quonset hut. He learned to assemble the prefabricated steel arches with breathtaking speed, to insulate them against the tropical sun, to make them livable. He saw how a simple, strong curve could enclose a massive volume with minimal material. When the war ended, Klaas brought his wife, Anke, and their two small children, Jan and Liesel, to northern Wisconsin. They bought a tract of cheap cut-over land with his mustering out pay and a small loan. They, like so many others, were chasing the post-war dream of self-sufficiency. Their first winter, 1948, was the classroom where they learned the brutal curriculum of the North Woods. They lived in a hastily built pine cabin, a structure considered standard and respectable by all their neighbors, and it nearly broke them. The cold was not a visitor. It was an occupant. It lived in the walls and under the floorboards. Anke's prized aluminum percolator, a wedding gift, sat too close to an exterior wall one night, and the first hard freeze warped its base so it would never again sit flat on the stove. A rubber hose for washing clothes, left on the porch, shattered like glass when Klaas tried to coil it. The most frightening lesson came from the milk. They kept it in what was supposed to be the coldest part of the cabin, an unheated pantry that functioned as an icebox. One morning, Klaas went to get the milk for the children's oatmeal and found the glass bottle had split clean in two, the frozen milk swelling up in a solid, useless column. It was a visceral demonstration of the cold's power. It could break glass. It could ruin food. It could, they both knew, just as easily break a family. That winter, Klaas burned through 4 cords of wood, and the cabin was never truly warm. He spent his days chopping and splitting, a slave to the stove, while Anke and the children huddled near it, wrapped in blankets. He was not a fool. He knew this was not sustainable. This was a war of attrition against the physics of winter, and he was losing. The problem wasn't the Wisconsin winter. The problem was the Wisconsin cabin. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was built on a series of flawed assumptions, each one bleeding precious heat and energy into the unforgiving air. The standard setup for a small family farm was a collection of separate, specialized buildings: a small house for the family, a barn for the livestock, a woodshed for fuel, and perhaps a root cellar or storage shed for provisions. Each structure was its own island, battling the cold alone. Arlo Finch, their neighbor, lived this reality every day. His cabin, though well built by local standards, was a thermal sieve. It was made of single-layer plank walls with no insulation. The gaps around the windows and doors were chinked with oakum and mud, but every blast of wind forced cold air through a dozen invisible cracks. The single-pane glass windows were portals for heat to escape, frosting over with intricate ferns of ice that never melted, even with the stove roaring. Arlo spent a third of his waking hours feeding his cast-iron stove, a hungry beast that consumed split oak and demanded more every hour. The heat it produced rose directly to the uninsulated ceiling and radiated out through the roof, leaving the floor perpetually cold. His wife and children lived in a constant state of layered wool. 50 yards away, his barn was even worse. It was a drafty structure of unfinished planks, designed only to keep the snow off his 2 dairy cows and a plow horse. On the coldest nights, the animals' body heat was utterly lost to the wind whistling through the walls. Their water troughs would freeze solid, and Arlo would have to break the ice with an axe every morning. The animals shivered, burning precious calories just to stay alive, their milk production dropping as their bodies fought the cold. Another 100 feet from that stood his woodshed, a 3-sided lean-to that kept the snow off the woodpile, but did nothing to protect it from the moisture-sucking cold. His wood was always slightly damp, burning inefficiently with more smoke than flame, producing less heat and more creosote in his chimney. Each building was a separate, losing battle. The total surface area exposed to the elements was enormous. Every square foot of roof and wall on the house, the barn, and the shed was a surface through which heat could escape. It was a strategy of division. And in the face of a unified, monolithic enemy like a Wisconsin winter, it was doomed to fail. Klaas saw this not as a failure of character or work ethic. No one worked harder than Arlo Finch, but as a failure of design. It was a profound misunderstanding of thermodynamics. They were fighting three separate wars when they should have been building a single fortress. The construction of de Boer's Folly began in earnest as the leaves turned from green to gold. The 60-foot arching ribs of the Quonset, purchased as military surplus for pennies on the dollar, were the first things to go up. Klaas, with his CB training, knew exactly how to assemble them. He and young Jan, only 12 but strong for his age, worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm. They laid the corrugated steel panels over the ribs, bolting them down one by one. The sound of their work, the metallic ring of hammers, and the screech of wrenches echoed across the clearing. Inside this vast, empty shell, the real work began. They were not building a single open space, but a carefully partitioned environment. At the front nearest the road, Klaas framed a compact, 800-square-foot living area on the concrete slab. It was a house within a house, 2 small bedrooms, a main living and cooking space, and a small washroom. He used standard lumber, but with one crucial difference. He left a 2-foot air gap between the outer wall of his framed cabin and the steel skin of the Quonset. Roscoe Mercer made his third visit then, clipboard in hand. He was accompanied this time by Jedediah Stone, the head of the town council, a man whose family had been logging this land for a century. They stood inside the cavernous space, dwarfed by the curving walls. "See, Jedediah? This is what I was telling you about," Mercer said, gesturing at the half-finished barn stalls in the middle section. "He's putting his cows right next to his kitchen. The code is clear." Jedediah, a practical man, was more concerned with the structure itself. "It's a tin can, Klaas," he said, his voice kind but firm. "It'll sweat with condensation in the winter like you wouldn't believe. Everything you own will be damp and rotten by spring, and the first heavy snow load, this thing will buckle." Klaas listened patiently. He pointed up at the arch. "The curve is strong," he said, "stronger than a flat roof. Snow will slide." He then pointed to a stack of paper-backed rolls near the wall. "And it will not sweat." The rolls were 6-inch thick bats of mineral wool insulation. This was his secret weapon. Working on a scaffold, he and Jan spent the next 2 weeks painstakingly fitting the insulation into every cavity between the steel ribs, covering the entire 2,400-square-foot surface of the arch. It was itchy, miserable work, but Klaas knew it was the most important part of the build. When they were done, the entire interior of the Quonset was lined with a thick, seamless blanket of insulation. Finally, they installed the partitions. They weren't solid walls. Between the cabin and the barn, and between the barn and the rear storage area, he hung massive, heavy-duty canvas tarps on steel cables, the kind used to cover cargo on ships. They reached from the floor to the arching ceiling, secured tightly at the edges, but allowing for a slow, deliberate exchange of air. The mockery continued throughout the build. "Heard de Boer's building a house out of paper walls," Arlo Finch remarked at the general store. Mercer, meanwhile, was preparing the official paperwork. He had spoken to the county health officer. They agreed. An official citation for violation of dwelling code, 1943, Section 4, subsection B, cohabitation of livestock and human occupants, would be issued. They would give him until spring to either move the animals or vacate the premises. Mercer felt he was being generous. The foolish man would learn his lesson soon enough when the winter came. In the center of the structure, In the barn section, just on the other side of the canvas partition from the living quarters, Klaas installed a single, modest potbelly stove. It was rated for 40,000 BTUs per hour, an amount considered woefully inadequate for a normal cabin, let alone a structure of this immense size. To his critics, it was the final, definitive proof of his madness. A tiny stove to heat a giant metal tube. He might as well try to warm the whole of Wisconsin with a single match. Klaas de Boer wasn't trying to heat a house, a barn, and a storage shed. He was managing the thermal dynamics of a single, closed system. The mockery from his neighbors and the citations from Roscoe Mercer came from a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield. They saw three separate structures under one curved roof. Klaas saw one enormous, 24,000 cubic foot pocket of air wrapped in a thick, insulated blanket. The problem wasn't adding enough heat. The problem was preventing the heat you already had from escaping. Let's break down the physics. The first element was the container itself. The Quonset arch, a semi-cylinder 60 feet long with a 20-foot diameter, enclosed a massive volume. But more important than the volume was the surface area. A curved surface has less area than a rectangular box of the same volume, meaning less skin exposed to the cold. More importantly, this entire surface, every single square foot, was insulated with a continuous 6-inch layer of mineral wool. This gave the structure an R value of approximately R24, a number unheard of in 1949 when a standard plank wall might have an R value of 2 or 3. This was the fortress wall. It dramatically slowed the rate of heat transfer, or what engineers call envelope loss. The second element was the heat source. There wasn't just one, there were 6. The most obvious was the 40,000 BTU per hour potbelly stove. A British thermal unit, or BTU, is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. 40,000 BTUs per hour is a substantial amount of heat, but in a conventional leaky cabin, most of it would fly up the chimney or radiate through the walls in minutes. Here it was being released into a tightly sealed, super insulated container. But the stove was only part of the equation. This is what everyone missed. Klaas's other 5 heat sources were alive. An adult dairy cow at rest generates approximately 800 BTUs of body heat per hour. A horse generates around 1,200 BTUs per hour. Klaas had 3 cows and 2 horses in the central chamber. Let's do the math. 3 cows times 800 BTUs is 2,400 BTUs. 2 horses times 1,200 BTUs is another 2,400 BTUs. Combined, his livestock were living, breathing furnaces, producing a steady, continuous 4,800 BTUs of heat every hour of every day. That was the equivalent of a small electric space heater running constantly for free. The total heat input into the system was the stove plus the livestock, 40,000 plus 4,800, for a total of 44,800 BTUs per hour. Now compare that to the heat loss. Based on the R24 insulation and the total surface area, Klaas had calculated that even on a brutally cold night, with the outside temperature at 30 degrees below zero, the total heat loss from the building's envelope would be approximately 30,000 BTUs per hour. This was the crucial insight. He was putting in nearly 15,000 BTUs more than he was losing. The system ran at a net positive. The canvas partitions were the final piece of genius. They were not airtight, which was intentional. They allowed for a very slow, gentle circulation of air throughout the entire 24,000 cubic foot volume. The warmest air from the stove and the animals would slowly mix with the air in the living quarters and the storage area, creating a stable, homogeneous temperature environment. The slight air exchange also prevented the buildup of ammonia and moisture that Mercer had feared. The vast air volume acted as a buffer, diluting any odors to imperceptible levels. The entire structure breathed as one. The house warmed the barn warmed the storage, and the single fire, aided by the quiet work of living bodies, warmed it all. That November, winter did not arrive. It attacked. A weather pattern the old-timers called a lake effect siege locked its jaws on northern Wisconsin and refused to let go. For 9 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 10 below zero, and at night it plunged to a soul-crushing 30 degrees. The wind howled out of the northwest, sculpting the 4 feet of snow that fell into drifts as high as a man's head. It was a winter that broke tools and spirits. For the neighbors, it was a desperate, losing fight. Arlo Finch's water pump froze solid, and he spent 2 days trying to thaw it with a blowtorch, his hands raw and numb. The pipes in his kitchen burst, flooding the floor with a sheet of ice. He was burning through his woodpile at an alarming rate, the stove glowing red-hot while the corners of the room remained frigid enough to see his breath. Jedediah Stone lost half his flock of chickens. They simply froze on their roosts one night in his drafty coop. The whole county was in a state of siege, hunkered down, counting the cost in livestock, firewood, and misery. But inside the great silver arch of de Boer's Folly, a different reality was unfolding. The single potbelly stove in the central chamber hummed along with a low, steady fire. Klaas fed it just a few logs every 4 hours. The wind that screamed over the roof was only a distant whisper. The snow that piled up against the sides only added to the insulation. Inside the front chamber, in their small cabin, the de Boer family lived in a bubble of impossible warmth. The temperature held at a steady 70 degrees. Anke didn't need to layer the children in wool sweaters. Young Liesel, who was 6, sat on the floor in her stocking feet playing with her dolls. The contrast with their first winter was absolute. There was no ice on the inside of the windows. There was no draft knifing through the walls. The proof of their comfort was in the small, mundane details of domestic life. One afternoon, during the worst of the storm, Anke decided to bake speculas, the spiced Dutch windmill cookies from her childhood. She rolled out the fragrant dough on the wooden kitchen table, the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom filling the warm air. Klaas sat nearby mending a piece of harness leather while Jan read a book. The scene was one of utter peaceful normalcy, a domestic tranquility that was, in the context of the blizzard raging outside, a profound miracle. The sounds were of a family living, not just surviving. The gentle thump of the rolling pin, the rustle of a page turning, the quiet crackle of the stove from beyond the canvas wall. The cold had been defeated so completely that they could afford to ignore it. By the 9th day of the siege, Roscoe Mercer had had enough. The constant stream of reports about frozen pipes and lost livestock had hardened his resolve. This de Boer character wasn't just eccentric, he was a danger to his family. Living in that unproven illegal structure during a record-breaking cold snap was irresponsible. Armed with the official citation from the county, he decided to drive out and serve it himself. It was a matter of public duty. His county-issued sedan was no match for the drifts. 200 yards from the gleaming silver arch, the car's rear wheels spun uselessly in a deep bank of snow. Mercer gunned the engine, but it only dug itself in deeper. Cursing, he pulled on his hat and gloves and stepped out into the brutal, wind-whipped cold. The air was so sharp, it felt like breathing powdered glass. He pulled his coat tight and began the long, punishing walk through the waist-deep snow. By the time he reached the door to the de Boer's living quarters, his face was numb and his lungs burned. He felt a grim satisfaction. The family inside was surely suffering, and this citation would be the first step in getting them to a safer, warmer place. He knocked, his glove making a dull thud on the wooden door. Klaas de Boer opened it. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Mercer could see his wife, also in a simple dress, and the 2 children playing on a rug on the floor. The air that washed over him from inside was a physical shock. It was warm. Not just stove warm, but a deep, even, impossible warmth. "Mr. Mercer," Klaas said, his voice calm, "you are a long way from your car." "Stuck," Mercer managed to say through chattering teeth. "In the drift. Need to use your phone to call for a tow." "Of course. Come in." Stepping inside was like entering another season. The cold fell away from him instantly. Anka handed him a steaming mug of coffee, and his frozen fingers fumbled to hold it. As he waited for the tow service to answer, he looked around the small, cozy space. There was no frantic energy, no sign of hardship. It was simply a home. After the call, a sense of professional duty wrestled with his disbelief. "I have this for you," he said, pulling the damp citation from his coat pocket. Klaas took it and glanced at it without expression. "The code," he said, nodding. "You are worried about the animals." "Among other things," Mercer said, his voice losing some of its earlier conviction. "Come," Klaas said. "I will show you." He led Mercer through the canvas partition into the central chamber. The air here was slightly cooler, maybe 60 degrees, and carried the clean, earthy scent of hay and livestock. The 3 cows and 2 horses stood calmly in their stalls, chewing their cud. The potbelly stove glowed with a gentle, contained heat. There was no foul odor, no overwhelming ammonia. Mercer looked up at the vast, insulated ceiling. He could feel the gentle air circulation, a slow, almost imperceptible current. "This is the engine room," Klaas said simply. Then he pulled back the second canvas partition, leading Mercer into the rear third of the arch, the storage area. Mercer braced himself for the biting cold of a warehouse. He expected to see his breath, but the air that met him was merely cool, perhaps 45 degrees. It was the temperature of a good root cellar. Sacks of potatoes were stacked against one wall, barrels of apples against another, and on a sturdy wooden shelf sat several large, wax-coated wheels of cheese. Klaas gestured to a pale, cream-colored wheel studded with dark seeds. "My wife's nagelkaas," he said, "clove cheese from home." Mercer, acting on instinct, reached out and placed his bare palm on the waxed rind. He expected it to be rock-hard, frozen solid, like everything else in this god-forsaken winter. But it wasn't. The wax was cool and firm, but pliable. It had the texture of a candle, not a stone. It was the proof. This was not a frozen shed. It was a climate-controlled larder, kept stable by the residual heat of the system. In that moment, Mercer thought of his own kitchen back in town, where a bag of potatoes left near the wall had frozen solid 2 nights ago. This storage space, the coldest part of Klaas de Boer's foolish structure, was warmer and more stable than his own heated house. The professional certainty drained out of him, replaced by a profound, humbling awe. He looked from the cheese to Klaas, whose calm, quiet face showed no hint of triumph. "My God, de Boer," Mercer whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't build a house in a barn. You built an ark." News of Roscoe Mercer's conversion traveled faster than his tow truck. He tore up the citation on the spot and, once back in town, spoke of what he had seen with the zeal of a convert. He described the shirt-sleeve warmth, the calm animals, and the unfrozen wheel of cheese. The story of de Boer's ark replaced the joke of de Boer's Folly. Neighbors who had mocked him now stopped by with questions, their skepticism replaced by a desperate curiosity. The story found its most powerful amplifier in an unexpected place. The pastor of the local Holland Reformed Church, hearing the tale from several of his congregants, saw in it a parable of Frisian ingenuity and faith. He wrote a letter to the editor of the Holland Reformed Weekly, a newspaper based in Shipbuilding that served the Dutch-American communities across the state. In February of 1950, the paper published a full article under the headline, "A Seabee's Ark in the Wisconsin Woods." The piece detailed the construction, the brutal winter test, and the simple, elegant physics behind it. Crucially, it included a floor plan, hand-drawn by Klaas himself, showing the three-chamber layout, the placement of the stove, and the canvas partitions. The article struck a chord, particularly with other Dutch-American veterans. These were men who had also served in the Seabees, who knew Quonset huts intimately, and who were now struggling on their own small post-war farms. They understood the language Klaas was speaking, the language of efficiency, insulation, and shared systems. The idea was not a bizarre folly to them. It was a logical extension of their own wartime experience. That spring, a handful of families from around the state made the pilgrimage to the de Boer farm. Klaas, a man of few words, shared his knowledge freely, walking them through the arch, explaining his calculations, and answering their questions with quiet patience. By the autumn of 1950, the visual proof of his idea began to appear across the Wisconsin landscape. 7 other families, all Dutch-American veterans, had purchased surplus Quonsets and erected their own 3-chamber compounds. The design spread, a testament to a solution so effective and economical that it couldn't be ignored. The frontier didn't reward credentials or conformity. It rewarded what worked. Klaas de Boer's 3-chamber Quonset was more than just a clever trick for surviving a harsh winter. It was a primitive but brilliant forerunner of concepts that would take building science another 50 years to formalize. What he created, through intuition and experience, was a high-performance building envelope. The seamless R24 insulation wrapping the entire structure is what modern architects call super insulation. His use of the animal's body heat was a form of passive heating, capturing and utilizing energy that was already present in the system. The entire concept of a single, integrated structure for living, labor, and storage anticipated the modern principles of integrated design, where a building is treated as a single, dynamic system rather than a collection of separate parts. He solved the problem of a Wisconsin winter decades before the vocabulary to describe his solution was even invented. The story of Klaas de Boer is a quiet testament to the power of seeing a problem differently. Where his neighbors saw a house, a barn, and a shed as 3 separate challenges requiring 3 separate fires, he saw a single, unified need: the survival and comfort of his family. He didn't try to fight the cold on 3 fronts. Instead, he redefined the boundaries of home itself. He drew a new, larger circle, one that encompassed not just his wife and children, but also their food, their animals, and their livelihood. He understood that the warmth of a living body, the heat from a single fire, and the integrity of a well-built shell were all parts of the same equation. He didn't build 3 houses in a row. He taught 1 arch to hold everything a family needs, and 1 fire to warm it all. On the unforgiving frontier, that simple, elegant insight was the difference between surviving and thriving. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and quiet genius compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories like it. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other modern building concepts do you see hidden in this 1949 design? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar methods in modern contexts should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.